I am an El Pasoan. I live in New York City. I spent some time in San Francisco, had two beautiful kids there, one of which, her birthday's today. So I'd like you to do me a favor, because I'm going to need this evidence later, probably in her teen years. And can everybody say happy birthday, Mariana? On 3. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But my formative years happened right here in El Paso. And that's what I want to share a story with you about. I was about 16 or 17 years old, and I was going to school on the west side of El Paso, and I was living with my mom on the east side of El Paso. That's the subject of a different TED Talk a different day. But I found myself on I-10, driving to the east side, and it was probably late at night, and I had probably had a long day of adventures with my friends, some of which are in the audience. And I found myself headed south on I-10. And in this moment, I was really, really frustrated the way a 16-year-old could be about being terribly inconvenienced with this mountain that was in my way that I wish someone had bored a tunnel right through it so it'd be easier for me, and because I was so important to myself. Why couldn't I just get where I was going on my own time and my own way? And just the way that life happens to you, I found that moment to become a moment of clarity. Because I looked to my right and I saw this, an APRA, where my grandfather was born and grew up and immigrated to El Paso from this place. A place that still today is makeshift housing and questionable electrical connections. And to my left, I saw this. And so I found myself just right in dead center of this place that, had I been born a little further this way, might mean a whole different life trajectory for me. And as I'm driving, I'm thinking, how small of me to be worried about my terrible inconvenience driving around this mountain in a car that was my own. Wasn't fancy, but it got me A to B relatively safely. And people on this side had maybe nothing but a view of this side. And that is what we call home. That's the US-Mexico border. The way that some people in other parts of the world might perceive differently than what it really is. But it was a moment of clarity for me that began this journey for me of empathy. It was a journey because I made lots of other judgments and mistakes along the way as I was becoming, from 16 to my undisclosed age today. But it was a journey. It began that journey. And it's important to also recognize that this place is not the only place that this exists. I'm blessed right now to have a job that takes me all over the world, and I see lots of different places that look a lot like this, which is, again, in the spirit of empathy. We are not alone in this relatively ambiguous separation of life. In Buenos Aires, there's a place in the middle of Buenos Aires called Via 31 that wasn't even incorporated as part of the city until just recently. Surrounded by this metropolitan world, and their experience or their interaction with the downtown they saw in the distance, I'm not joking, was what they call slum tourism. People would get on a bus with a camera and drive through this Via 31 to see how other people live. And it's also not these very stark geographical borders. Sometimes it's hidden in plain sight. In Chicago, they had to start a campaign for corner stores to sell healthy food, fresh food choices, because those store owners believed that people of color in these parts of town would only want and only buy fast food and candy and junk. These barriers exist in all kinds of unexpected but very impactful places. And more today, we live in a place where it can creep into our lives even subconsciously. Who here follows someone you don't like on Twitter? And so that can reinforce some very siloed beliefs, some very selfish perspective. And so why does all of this matter? Because it is continuing to feed this division in the world. Political things like presidential elections and Brexit, and real life things like Hong Kong protests. This is the manifestation of that bubble, of that division, of that stark line, that nearly meaningless border that changes one person's life perspective and future from another. And I don't have to tell you when this kind of situation can hit home, and I'm not trying to be dramatic, but we experience this firsthand. The consequence of this division. So now that I've just created the doomsday sentiment in the room, I want to talk to you about how we heal it. So these cities, these urban centers, are the place that people are connected. They're forced in many ways to interact with one another. Yet they are still a place where we're seeing such division. So how do we move things forward? How do we heal this? Cities are a place where people are migrating in droves. Actually, the size of a Singapore, 6 million people a month are moving to urban centers in the world. So the time is now. The time is right now for us to think about these impacts. Think about these arbitrary borders, physical, mental, emotional, and the impact they're having on our society, because things are only going to get bigger and better or not. It's also the place where the world's economy exists. The people in these urban centers are responsible for 80% of global GDP and 90% of intellectual property, patents. The things that you and I are going to experience in the future are invented by the people in this place, in these urban centers. Even more important that we help them, that we collectively build a culture of empathy so that we appreciate the other people that don't look and act and think like us. So the other thing that is very important to understand that's happening in cities today is diversity. Those 6 million people moving to cities every month don't come from those cities that they are moving to by definition, right? So they look different, they act different, they think different. So how are we as urban centers, communities, going to invite them into our world? I think that we have to be very thoughtful about it. I think we have to be very intentional about it. And some of us kind of require some immersion to accomplish that empathy. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. 30 cities in the US are now majority Latino. And the Latino culture, the group collectively, is the fastest growing in the US. So I would also submit this as a call to action for communities like this to lead this. We are the face of the future. I used to tell people when I lived here a few years back that I felt like El Paso was what the future city would look like. I didn't realize how right I was. So especially in moments like this, when the spotlight is on us, when things have impacted us in really deep ways, we must step up. We must show the rest of the country and frankly the world the way that we can use that diversity and use that culture to bring people together, not to further push them apart. So okay, Miguel, empathy, so what? What's the end game? Now I'm empathetic, now what? I argue that it's the pathway to happiness. Far too long, we've been told this is what it looks like. A white picket fence, well, maybe in El Paso it looks like this. Rock walls. I'm not beating up on the rock wall industry. But we've been told that success looks like space and separation. So I'm just going to challenge you, give you a kind of a mental challenge to tell me what is different about this and that spot on I-10 that I drove by that separated one people from another. Now, I'm not suggesting everyone, abandon your suburban life and move downtown, although that would be pretty cool. But I just submit to you to think about what is happiness really coming from? There's a lot of studies that are showing that while we are more economically prosperous, we're actually less happy because we're just chasing the next thing. And arguably because we're lacking social interaction. You go into your garage, you get in your car, probably before you open the garage door, you back out of your garage and you go to work. You probably pull into a garage, you get out of your car, you go into your office surrounded by people who probably have views that look similar to you. And then you rinse and repeat. And so think about how can we find ways to intentionally engage in that which is uncomfortable. And I'll give you one more quick story. I was invited to work for the government. Brian gave you my bio. I had a healthy sense of skepticism about public service employees. I thought they were showing up to work late, leaving early. Basically, riding it to the pension. I was invited to come into public service, and it took a little while, and I gained a deep sense of empathy. I found people who were just as talented, just as driven, maybe more, than any other private sector company I had ever worked for. I wasn't smart enough to learn that from the outside. I had to go inside and experience it. So I offer to you this concept of empathy by immersion. Don't leave it to chance. Find a way to actually get engaged. Talk to someone that you disagree with. Follow someone on Twitter that has different views than you, if for no other reason but to learn why. If you're Ellen, you hang out with George Bush. And I offer this to you to acknowledge that sometimes it's going to take courage. Sometimes it's going to take personal courage and even public courage to say, no, it's okay for me to be surrounded by people who don't look like me, who don't think like me. So I'll leave you with this. Seek immersive experiences that can lead to empathy. If you voted for Hillary, watch some Fox News. If you voted for Trump, watch some CNN. Surround yourself with people who don't look like you, don't think like you. Go to dinner parties, go to organizations, put yourself in environments that are uncomfortable. Many of you, not me, go to the gym and you do it to your bodies every day. How about do it to your brain? How about do it to your soul? I'll leave you with this. If we don't, the call to action, it is critically important, not only to your happiness, my happiness, the happiness of cities like El Paso, the happiness of the world in general, but I also submit to you that it's going to be critical to the future happy birthdays for Mariana. Thank you.